Hello, friends. It is so nice to be here with you, those of you at the Theosophical Society. And thank you to John and everybody for having me here for this lecture on bereavement and bad theology, a toxic cocktail. And so I think before I start, I'd like to just issue a little disclaimer that I am going to talk about some religious beliefs that I have found in my professional experience and in my doctoral research to be harmful and dangerous to people who are experiencing loss and grief and trauma. So it may be a little bit of a uncomfortable topic for some of you, but I hope that you'll stay with me and really listen to some of this because it's really important information, especially now that so many of us are grieving so many losses as a result of COVID-19, not just deaths, but loss of income, loss of identity, loss of social interaction, loss of personal freedom, loss of faith in the various systems that support us. So I'm kind of going to lay that out there as a foundation before we go forward. So I am Dr. Terri Daniel, and I'm bringing this information to you from my perspective as a hospital chaplain and a hospice chaplain and grief counselor and an educator. I teach at two seminaries in the interreligious chaplaincy program and in a program called Spirituality and Mental Health. And I'm basing this material on my own personal experience growing up in America, but also on what I've observed with my clients and patients and students and the people who come to my workshops and producing the Afterlife Conference for the last 11 years. So here we go. I'm going to jump right into it. I'm sitting here recording this all by myself on Zoom, so it's kind of strange not having any faces to look at or people to ask questions. So I guess I'm just going to talk to you straight on. So my work is focused on grief and loss with a specific focus on how certain religious beliefs can complicate the healing process from loss and trauma. And so I want to start out by first giving you a definition of historical critical versus devotional study of religion. Historical critical is what religious scholars do. It's what we do in universities. We study the history, the language, the writing style of scriptures. We compare them to other documents that were written at the time, because if you have multiple attestations of something, then it is more likely to be historically true. We analyze really literally every word, and we do it within the context of history so that we can see where the teachings in the scriptures match up with what was actually going on in the world at the time, or if they are symbolic, allegorical stories to try to impart a esoteric spiritual message. That's what historical critical study is. The other form of study is devotional study, and that's basically what you find in evangelical communities and, among biblical literalists, where you read scripture and you study history based on the idea that everything in the Bible is directly dictated by God. It has no errors, it has no contradictions, and it is absolute historical fact. So I'm going to come at you today from, of course, historical critical study. And I'm going to start by saying that religion, the formation of religions, is actually almost always based on the idea of loss and how to cope with loss, trying to make sense of loss. So, for instance, in a primitive tribe, in early times, people would gather around and they'd wonder, why did the crops not grow? Why did the baby die? Why did a storm destroy our village? And from these losses, we need to create meaning. We need to build meaning around the losses. We need to answer that question, why? And from this, we've created cosmologies and theologies that kind of help explain it to us. It's rare to find a religious doctrine or a religious belief that's based on everything going right, except when it's in response to being rescued or relieved from something that went wrong. So when the crops die, your particular religious community might say, well, we didn't pray hard enough, or people in the village broke the laws and were sinners, and so God is punishing us by taking the crops away. So, the loss is as a result of us not doing something right. I think maybe I'm going to go back here for a minute to something in Old Testament teachings that one of my favorite scholars, Richard Elliott Friedman, talks about. And when the Old Testament was written, it was written down when that particular tribe of people was in bondage, was basically held captive in Babylon. And prior to that, in the previous 1,000 years, all the stories, and we're talking about the story of Genesis and Noah's Ark and Abraham, all of that, they were told orally. But it wasn't until this captivity that the people decided, you know what, we better write this down because our culture is being taken away from us. We're being stripped of everything. So we better write it down so that it will be remembered. And that's when we know that the earliest writings came about. And in the creation of these descriptions of the beginning of life on earth and the formation of human cultures came this image of God. And this image of God, of this ancient God, Yahweh, was kind of a mean guy. And one of the theories is the people who are writing this were basing it on their experience at the time. They were oppressed by really mean guys, and they were constantly being trodden down and pushed down. And their theology said that they were the chosen people and that God would promise them riches and world domination and progeny and land and all these wonderful things. And now here they were captive in another country. And according to their belief system, the only reason that could have happened is if they did something wrong. And that's where a lot of the foundation of a lot of our theology comes from, because prior to that, we had a polytheistic system. We had this with the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, where there were many gods. And so you could anger one god and please another, or many different things could happen because there were gods that ruled different aspects of life. But when it became monotheistic, when there's only one God ruling over all the other gods, pretty much with that God's rule that you have to worship him very devoutly and very exclusively, then if something doesn't go right, you're basically experiencing that because you did something wrong. What happens with most people, and I'm only going to be speaking about American Judeo-Christian culture because that's what I know best, and I'm sure this applies to other cultures, but I have to stay within my area of familiarity. So here's what happens with most of us. We're given our religious education when we're very, very young, starting at 2, 3, 4 years old. Maybe we go to Sunday school, maybe we go to church or synagogue, but even if we don't have religious families, these teachings come to us through the culture, through television, through Christmas, commercialization of religion. It's just everywhere, just even in the language that we hear. When you're a little child and somebody in, your family dies, you might hear people talk about them being in heaven or being with Jesus or whatever is in your family. So we receive this stuff, we absorb this stuff from everywhere. Even if you were raised in an atheist family or a Unitarian family, you still pick it up wherever you go. My family was Jewish, but they were very secular. They didn't have any religious beliefs that I know of. I certainly didn't have any religious education. And they just kind of liked the culture. They liked the food and the family get-togethers and the holiday celebrations. So what I absorbed from them was mostly that cultural stuff, but there was also a lot of kind of hidden underneath theology with things like, God's going to punish you if you don't clean your room, that sort of thing. And so what happens to most of us is we have that on a scale, varying degrees. It could be extremely, extremely religious indoctrination when you're a young child to something very loose like mine. And what happens is we receive that at 5, 6, 7 years old, and we never think about it again, because why would we? Unless for some reason theology is really important to you, you just kind of file it away with everything you learned as a child, and there it sits until something tragic happens. So you filed that away when you were 5 years old, and now you're 55 and you've got liver cancer. And now, in order to cope with that terrible news or that tragic loss, you're going to reach back into your toolbox for something metaphysical, something spiritual that might help you cope with it, that might help explain why. And when you go into that toolbox, what you're going to find is a 5-year-old's understanding of the divine, of this thing that we know as God. And that's not going to be very helpful. And what that is what we call embedded or inherited theology, the theology that was embedded in us and that we inherited through our culture. Hand in hand with embedded theology, or perhaps the opposite of it, is something that we call deliberative or chosen theology, which is the theology we build on our own, that we cobble together through our curiosity and our interest and research and reading and maybe traveling around the world and looking at other cultures and other religions and picking up different ideas that we deliberately build into that toolbox. So I happen to think that the more variation you have in the toolbox, the better you are going to be able to cope with trauma and loss and grief. I want to do a couple of things here, beginning with defining what I call toxic theology and positive and negative religious coping. Let's go to positive and negative religious coping first. There's been some really excellent research done on this by one researcher named Kenneth Pargament, and he identifies the 5 basic functions of religion as finding meaning in a traumatic or difficult event, establishing a sense of control, finding comfort in a dangerous world, a sense of social intimacy and community, and assistance in major life transitions. And in his research with hospital patients, with dying people, with grieving people, he identified what he broke into what he calls positive religious coping and negative religious coping. And in positive religious coping, a person who is diagnosed with a terminal illness or has just lost their spouse or their child or their health in some form would relate to the divine in various ways, such as looking for a stronger connection to the divine, seeking a sense of love and care, asking God to help them let go of anger and blame, trying to put together, their own proactive plans for coping with the problem in conjunction and co-creation with God, perhaps even asking for forgiveness for sins, and generally looking to religion to work as a partner. Negative religious coping is a feeling that God has abandoned you, or that you are being punished because you weren't religious or pious or devoted enough. Feeling that you are not loved anywhere in the universe. Perhaps feeling that your church or religious community has abandoned you. Perhaps in some really extreme situations, blaming your bad luck on the devil, which is really common, more than you probably know. And questioning your value in the world. Do I have any power? Do I have any value? Is there this thing called God that supposedly loves me? And if so, why did this God do this thing to me? So this kind of questioning is good if you allow it to be fluid and movable. So, but if you are locked into the belief that, as many people are, that all illness and suffering comes from the devil, and all good stuff comes from God, or that God punishes us, you're going to have a much more difficult time getting to a healthy rebalance of your life after a traumatic loss. Let me give you a couple of examples. I think I'll start with examples now. One of my colleagues was telling me recently about, he's a pediatrician, about a case he had where the child was 2 years old, dying from brain cancer. The parents were Pentecostal, and they absolutely believed that prayer would save this child. And it was very clear to the medical team that this child was going to die. And they wanted to have an end of life conversation with the parents to help them cope. And the parents refused to have that conversation because they believed that even thinking about the child's death, talking about it, even talking about it and considering it as a possibility would prove to God that their faith wasn't strong enough. So, of course, the child died. What happens to their faith? What happens to their foundation in reality? It's a big shakeup. And when you have a big shakeup like that, you can go in one of two directions. You can get really angry at God. You can become very bitter and very vindictive and angry at the world, at the medical establishment. But mostly in a situation like that, you're going through your grieving process with this anger at God. That's one way you can go. God disappointed me. God didn't do what he was supposed to do. God didn't hold up his end of the agreement. The other way you can go with that is you can do the exploration and questioning that I talked about earlier, and you start to think, well, what? Maybe God doesn't really work that way. Maybe the beliefs that I was given all my life about God answers prayers, maybe it's not true. Maybe God is something different than what I thought. And from that place, you can go and explore and see what other cultures are doing, see what other religions believe. We have in this world with us right now something that our parents did not have, and that's the internet. And we can go anywhere we want. We can go and see, an Irish wake or a funeral in Ghana or a Chinese ancestor altar, which is in every house where it's an altar to the dead, or the shamans in Peru and their beliefs about the afterlife. It's wide open world right now. And the more we use the tools at our disposal, in this case, the internet, to expand our understanding, the more different kinds of meanings we're going to be able to find to assist us in moving through loss and grief. Let me give you a couple other examples. I had a client who, her 9-year-old son died from cancer, from leukemia, and she believed that God was punishing her because she had had an abortion 20 years earlier. She knew in her intellectual mind that that's probably not really possible, and that God probably doesn't really work like that because it just doesn't pencil out in rational thinking. But it was so inculcated in her that she could not move forward with healthy mourning of that child because she felt so oppressed by guilt. If I didn't have that abortion, this child would be alive today. God took one in exchange for the other. Another mother that I met at a conference had lost all 4 of her children in separate, unrelated incidents over a 25-year period. I don't know the details, but let's just say one of them died in infancy. Another one got hit by a car at 10 years old. Another one got in a motorcycle accident at 20. And another one died of an illness at 30, something like that. And she said to me, I thought nothing like this would happen to me if I was a good Christian and pleased God. If I only knew what I did wrong, what I did to displease God, then I could correct it and these things would stop happening to me. And I wouldn't have to suffer anymore. These 3 examples that I just gave you are beautiful examples of toxic theology. toxic theology has been defined by a lot of scholars and researchers. And I suppose if we're going to look for key points, we could say that it includes form of emotional, spiritual, moral, and sometimes even physical power abuse. It complicates or compromises your mental health and well-being. In many of these theologies, it is noble to suffer. It is noble to think of yourself as a lowly, helpless, wretched sinner. And the only way out of that state is to embrace a particular theology and follow a certain path. There are different degrees of toxicity. It could be very simple all the way to very extreme. And very extreme, I'm talking about something like you may recall the Westboro Baptist Church, Fred Phelps and his crew, who would go and picket military funerals with signs that say, God hates fags. They had signs that say, God hates you. These people were certifiably insane. And one of the family members who escaped is the son, Nathan Phelps, who, if you want to Google him and listen to his story, it's quite amazing. So that's the extreme end of the spectrum. And a less extreme end of the spectrum might be exemplified in this story that I'm going to tell you. I was co-facilitating a grief group for children whose parents had died. And this was in middle school. So the kids were 11, 12, 13 years old. And we were doing an art therapy project. And I overheard 3 boys having this conversation. The first boy said, I don't understand how anybody could go to heaven. There are too many rules. My dad never went to church. He was an alcoholic. So does that mean he didn't go to heaven? And the second boy answered, no, he can still go to heaven because God forgives everybody, right? So doesn't that mean everybody will go to heaven? And the third kid, who was the youngest of the group, said, but then there would be too many people up there. How could all those people fit up in the sky in heaven? So what we see in this response of these kids, and this is not necessarily toxic theology, but it has the seeds of becoming so. One of the other boys in the group told the story of his mother who had killed herself, and he had heard that suicide was a sin and was very distressed that his mother was going to spend eternity in hell. So what's happening with these kids is the first 2 kids who are asking these questions like, how can everybody go to heaven if they're good, or do they get forgiven? It's a healthy thing they're doing. They're grappling with theological questions. But it's a bit of a burden on a kid whose parents have just died and they have this huge grief to deal with, and they're having to deal with these big existential questions. The third child, the one who wondered that there were too many people in heaven and how did they all fit in the sky, was looking at a literal interpretation of heaven that is physically located in the sky. So they're representing all these different stages of faith development. And I'm going to move over here to something I want to share with you. There was a psychologist and researcher by the name of James Fowler. He recently died. He did most of his work in the 60s and 70s. And he did some research on what he calls stages of faith. And it's based on what anybody who studied psychology knows as stages of cognitive development, like Erik Erikson's, stages. A 2-year-old can think this way, and then when you're 7, you start to be able to discern this and that and process information in this way. And then when you're 14, and so on into adulthood, how our cognitive skills develop in a normal, healthy lifespan from infancy to old age. So Fowler came along. And he took this stage idea and he applied it to how we understand God, or how we understand the divine, or how we understand metaphysics, or whatever word that you want to use. And he calls it the stages of faith development. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll very briefly hit on it. You can Google this, it's everywhere. A child, when they're first able to use speech and to organize symbols and visual ideas of things, still takes things pretty literally when they're like 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. Children will believe anything you tell them at that age. You know, they look at cartoons and they believe that horses can fly and fishes can talk and all of that. That's real to them. So when you start telling them, you know, these Bible stories about Noah's Ark and the animals and Jonah swallowed by a whale, you know, they take that pretty seriously. And at this stage, which Fowler calls the intuitive reflective faith stage, here's an example of what that looks like. A 4-year-old and her father were walking on the beach and came across a dead seagull. And the girl looked at her dad and said, "What happened to the bird, Daddy?" And he said, "Well, bird died and went to heaven." So the kid looks up at the sky, because that's where heaven is, looks down at the bird and says, "Did God throw it back down?" So that's the kind of literalism we're talking about in that stage. When the child gets a little bit older, 6, 7 years old, they're beginning to understand symbolism and figurative meanings of stories, and, things that were fantasies can now be kind of put through the washing machine and sorted out of what's fantasy and what's real. And they have a little bit of discernment. But what starts to happen around that time, and now we're going into the next stage when we're now in adolescence, is even if you're hearing these stories and grappling with these beliefs, for example, hasn't every child who's ever been told the Adam and Eve story asked this question? If Adam and Eve had 2 sons, where did the rest of the people come from? Most smart 7-year-olds will ask that question. And so in starting to ask these questions, what happens next when you get into adolescence is you may be questioning, you may be wondering about these things, but you are in an environment where everybody believes the same thing, your family, your church, your community, and you don't question because you want to fit in, you want to belong. One of the most important things to a 13-year-old is to belong to a group, friends, maybe not family, but of course they need family. We all do when we're young and can't take care of ourselves. So we just kind of quell that and we just kind of go along with groupthink. And so we hold that belief. And then, of course, there are more stages where something will happen that will trigger deeper questioning. In the context of what we're talking about right now, that would be a traumatic loss that makes you question, wait a minute, maybe my beliefs, my inherited embedded beliefs don't make sense and I need some new beliefs. And so that brings us into the later stages where we're actually opening up to new ideas and allowing them to become part of our personal outlook, philosophy, and reflecting on them and trusting our intuition about what feels right to us. And that's when we began expanding. And so if we can get, to that place, we're going to have a better foundation for moving through loss and grief. But here's the thing. Most people don't get to that place. And when I say most people, I know that's not a very scientific term. Statistically in America right now, and I'm sure you've heard this, the religious landscape is changing dramatically. Church attendance is way down. I actually don't have that information in front of me. Okay, here we go. Let me give you some statistics. Americans believing in biblical literalism dropped from 65% in 1960 to 30% in 2010. By the way, these statistics are from the Pew Research Organization on America's Religious Landscape. In 1952, 75% of Americans said that religion was, quote, very important in their lives. The highest ever since the people have been keeping track of this and studying this. 75% religion is very important. And in 1957, just a few years later, when asked whether religion was relevant to today's world or out of date, 81% said it was relevant, another all-time high. So there are these periods of religiosity in America, And right about the 30s through the 50s, they called it the high tide of civic religion. If you were an American, you were basically a Christian. There was also a study done in the 50s called Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. And they surveyed thousands and thousands of people, and something like 98% of the respondents, I'm guessing at that number, identified as either Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. You didn't have a category called other. You didn't have spiritual but not religious. You didn't have many any Buddhists or atheists or Unitarians. They were there, but the numbers were so small they were hardly noticeable. So that's what it was like in the 50s. In the 60s, everything changed. And I'm going to give you a background on that in a minute. In the 1960s, the fraction of Americans that said religion was very important to them fell from 75% in 1952 to 52% in 1965. That's a pretty big dip. And in response to that, I know I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole right here. In the 70s and 80s, the religious establishment perceived this as a moral decline. And so in response to this moral decline, trying to get everybody back on board into the civic religion thing is when we started to get televangelists like Pat Robertson and Jimmy Swaggart. But that's another story altogether. Let me tell you a little bit about what happened in the 60s, which I'm sure many of you already know. So in 1950, China invaded Tibet, and the monks in the monasteries in the mountains fled and went into exile. The monasteries were burned, the books, the libraries, the monks escaped, and they traveled. They went to India, and eventually they made it to Europe. And eventually, after that, they came to the West. And that happened pretty much in the early 60s. And some of you may be old enough to remember beatniks and getting, how the beatniks started to get into Zen Buddhism. And certainly in the later part of the 60s, the hippies, were very interested in Eastern mysticism. That's how that happened. That's how it came here. So getting... that was what these, televangelists thought was the beginning of moral decline, and they pushed back really hard to try to turn it around. But what happened in the psychology world at the time was these ideas that we got from the East started to filter into grief theory and grief counseling. And the old model of understanding grief, which was started by Freud in the 30s, that the idea of processing grief is that you're aiming for disconnection, you're aiming for detachment from the lost object, the person who has died, whatever you're grieving. And that is the goal, to close your heart and be disconnected. What we learned when these Eastern models started to come to the West, and the psychologists and researchers started to pick up on it, is that there are other ways to heal. And one of the ways is what they call continuing bonds. And we learned this from Buddhism and reincarnation, that we can reframe the way we look at the dead person as that they're not dead. They're still somewhere, and we can continue to have a relationship with them. And we can, we recognize this because we see it so prominently in many other cultures. So that changed a whole lot about how grief was handled in psychology. And it also kind of moved us away from some of this extreme religiosity that can be so difficult for us. I want to show you a clip. I'm kind of jumping around here, but I want to go back a little bit to what we were talking about, how beliefs are embedded in children and how they can make grief so difficult. I probably should have showed this to you a little bit earlier. I am going to share my screen right now here on Zoom, and I'm going to show you a news clip about, this is pretty old. I think this is from 2015, maybe. There was a 10-year-old boy who had brain cancer, and the news crew in his local town went to his school and interviewed him and his classmates and his teacher in the classroom. And the teacher had told the children, if we pray for our friend, his name's Kyler, if we pray for Kyler and his brain cancer, God will listen. So all the kids started praying that Kyler would get better. So let me just show you that part right now, and then I'll come back and tell you how that story
is a highly aggressive tumor at the base of the brain that's difficult to treat. And of course, we learned about that rare pediatric cancer through our stories about Lauryn Hill.
And now it is Kyler Bradley's cancer, and as Local 12's Deb Dixon explains, once again, this is not just a story about cancer, but community support and the personal strength of a boy who believes in miracles.
Parentheses, exponents.
This is where Kyler Bradley wants to be, his 5th grade class at Fairfield Intermediate School. He just wants to feel ordinary.
What is your favorite kind of ice cream? Yeah, baseball. Mine's chocolate.
Kyler knows the truth about his highly aggressive brain cancer.
Kyler knows he has a tumor. He knows he has brain cancer. He knows it isn't operable, and he knows his time is limited here on Earth.
The tumor was discovered just 10 days ago after he went to the eye doctor. 10 days ago, the Bradley family's world turned upside down.
It's almost trying to read through a whole book and find out when the end is. And it's hard, because you just wonder how many your pages are your days, and the end is the end.
But Kyler told me he wants people to believe with him. Praying for a miracle? You believe in miracles, don't you, Kyler? Yes. So do his classmates.
As long as we pray and believe, God ought to hear it.
Their teacher planted that idea when she told 30 10-year-olds about Kyler's cancer. The straight-A student is loved here in Miss Center's 5th grade class. Physically, they've watched him change daily. 10 days ago, he was walking.
You might feel some scared feelings inside. You might feel worried. But we have to share hope. We have to share positivity, because that's the only way we're going to get through it together.
Hope, positivity, and some fun as Kyler is handed a silly string jar.
He can come here and hang out with his best buds and just forget about everything else.
One side of Kyler's mouth droops these days, making it harder to talk. But he still gets a laugh when the principal invites him to a room with candy for an upcoming event.
Probably 500 bags of candy down there right now. You want to go down there? You want to take them all? Okay.
One of Kyler's dreams is to be a newsman, so we let that happen.
Kyler Bradley,
Can I have your autograph? Can I have your autograph?
Tell him, say we're going to be...
Kyler told me he doesn't want to die, but he also believes if everyone prays for him, God has to listen. Deborah Dixon, Local 12 News.
Okay, if I was teaching a class right now, which I guess I am, I would say, who wants to raise your hand and tell me what was wrong with that story? It's, by the way, 6 months after this, Kyler did die. And these children, I just cannot imagine what it would be like for them to go home to their parents and say, well, Kyler himself said that if we prayed to God, God would listen. And the teacher told us that if we prayed, God would listen. And why didn't God listen? So these kids are grieving. I mean, a 10-year-old classmate becoming so severely sick right in front of your eyes and dying so quickly. This is not a normal experience for 5th graders. So it's a shocking, traumatic loss for them. And they're grieving that. And now they have this big question. We did what we were supposed to do. We followed what our culture told us. We asked this thing called God to intervene, and God didn't intervene. What went wrong? So depending on what these parents said to these children, they're going to be formed in their spiritual views one way or another. On the extreme version, of evangelical belief, somebody might say, well, your faith wasn't strong enough. Not every single kid in that class prayed hard enough, or maybe you had some atheists or pagans or something in there that polluted the mix of prayers. I mean, who knows what they would say? And on the other end of the spectrum, a parent might say, we just don't really understand how God works, or what prayer is. So I took you on a little diverted tour there. Sorry about that. Let me try to get back to to current events. Here's another example of toxic theology that's pretty current. And it's painful to talk about this, but it was in the news. It's happened a couple of weeks ago, where I'm sure you heard about this. A young man went to these massage parlors that he had frequented that were owned by Asians and staffed by Asian women, and he shot them. Mass shooting of Asian massage parlor staff. And what we know about this shooter right now is that he was a devout Christian and was completely wrapped up in what is known as purity culture, where sex is bad. You should be a virgin until you're married. Your sex drives are evil and sinful. And that's what drove him to do this. Obviously, he was mentally unbalanced, but that's another form of toxic theology. And we just see this everywhere. And it's in politics now too, as I'm sure that you know. I sure wish I was here live with you, because I would love to hear your questions and your comments so that I can interact with you. It's kind of strange just sitting here talking all by myself. Okay, one more thing I want to get to before we're done. And I know I'm talking really fast and giving you a lot of material. Let's move up into kind of our current world that many of us know about and talk about the law of attraction. This is what I have to say about that. A lot of people in the New Age movement are big fans of The Secret, which was a book and then a movie that talked about a new theology called the law of attraction, which isn't really new, but it's kind of was the latest thing for a while. And what this law of attraction said, according to this book called The Secret, was that that we create our own reality by what we put out to the universe. What we put out to the universe will feed back to us. That was basically the bottom line. If you think positive thoughts and say positive words, you will feed that into the universe and it will feed back to you the positive things. So, that has been taken to all kinds of extremes. Like if you imagine that you have $1 million in the bank and you only think in terms of, I have money, I have abundance, I can pay my bills, there's a beautiful car sitting in the driveway, I have a beautiful wife and a beautiful house, and you see yourself having it, your thoughts will program the universe to give you those things because you are the creator of your reality. That's how I would sum it up. So in my work as a hospice chaplain and hospital chaplain, interfaith chaplain, I should add, and in my work as the producer of the Afterlife Conference, which has been going on for 11 years, I have had many people come up to me who believe in this idea of the law of attraction. And this is what they say. I've done everything right. I have, envisioned abundance and positivity. I have said my affirmations. I dismiss all negative thoughts. In my meditations, if something negative or scary comes up, I burn it up into the universe and I only allow positive things. I only speak positive words. I eat healthy food. I do everything that I'm supposed to do, but I still am poor, and I'm still alone and can't find a mate, and I still have cancer. What am I doing wrong? Now, does this sound familiar to you, like something I told you earlier about the woman who lost 4 children, who thought if she was a faithful Christian and pleased God that nothing bad would happen to her? It should sound familiar because it's exactly the same thing. So I think that this teaching, called the law of attraction, is one of the greatest spiritual untruths ever told, and is also a form of toxic theology, because it is just another form of God in the sky theology that tells us if we do a certain thing, i.e., please God, we won't suffer. It's based on the idea that suffering is bad and should be avoided, and we can avoid it by thinking and behaving a certain way to gain the approval and the partnership of the universe, i.e., God. It's an old form of bad theology that has simply been repackaged for a new audience. And I think I'm going to end this here with this thought. Instead of that kind of theology, instead of that idea that God or the universe, or whatever you want to call it, has good and evil, reward and punishment, this, dualistic balance thing in terms of suffering and grief and loss, consider this. Suffering has a purpose. Pain has a purpose. And suffering should not and cannot be avoided, because this is where growth comes from. As Rumi said, the wound is where the light comes in. I've had it described to me as like if you're swimming and you push off the edge of the pool with your feet to go do that next lap, and you get to the end and you push off again. It's like pushing off the edge of a pool, because we need something to push off from in order to go forward. It's propulsion. It's spiritual propulsion. We did not come here to live in bliss and unconditional love. We came here to experience physicality and all that it has to offer, both good and bad experiences. They're both necessary for conscious living, and it's like positive and negative charges on a battery. The battery won't work if only one end is plugged in. So in summary, for what I've been talking about here, in terms of loss, trauma, and grief, and there's so much more I can say about this, and I would encourage you to read my new book called Grief and God, When Religion Does More Harm Than Healing. In terms of grief and loss and trauma and suffering, what I would ask you to consider in yourself and in others that you may be trying to help is, where are those embedded, disempowering, toxic religious beliefs having an impact on you? Now, if you see this in yourself, you're members of the Theosophical Society. So if you do see this in yourself, you know what to do. You know what to read and who to talk to and what to talk about to sort of expand out of that. If you see this in other people, like your family members or friends, people ask me this all the time: what can I do to help them? The answer is nothing. You can't do anything. You follow the lead of how we're trained in chaplaincy, which is to just be present for their pain. Don't try to talk them out of their lifelong beliefs unless they open the door, unless they ask you, unless they say, hey, you belong to this Theosophical Society. What does that mean anyway? Because, this horrible thing happened to me and I feel like God's punishing me and none of my beliefs are working. What are your beliefs? What's this Theosophical stuff anyway? And then you can help them. But unless they ask, they aren't going to be open to hearing it. So you have to train yourself to how to be present and compassionate and loving to people who are struggling with this. And I think that's probably a pretty good place to end. I just want to say thank you to everybody over there in the Theosophical Society for having me back for another lecture. I hope this was meaningful and useful to you. Thank you so much, everybody. And perhaps I'll see you in person next year. Okay. Bye-bye.